Hello everyone! Welcome to the 2021 McDonald's Online Education Workshop. 亲爱的观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎来到2021年第2场世界日报麦当劳教育线上研讨会的现场。I'm your host for today. My name is Zhao Wang. 我是今天的主持人王早早。McDonald's Education Workshop is an important annual event in our community.We would like to say thank you to our partner McDonald's for the continuing support throughout the hard times. Today's workshop is very, very important because, well, it's about the COVID and all the impacts under the COVID-19. There's a lot of policy changes, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below.麦当劳教育博览会呢，是我们社区当中的重要活动之一。在这里也要感谢麦当劳多年以来的支持，为华人社区提供最新的教育资讯，邀请教育专家、大学招生官、常青藤的学生为华裔的学生和家长们答疑解惑。由于疫情的关系，教育政策、大学申请等等方面都有着不小的变化。所以呢，如果您在听讲座的过程当中有任何的疑问，都欢迎在下方给我们留言互动。Also, I would love to introduce the APA Next. It is an all-new education program from McDonald's that aims to empower and uplift Asian Pacific American students throughout their academic journey. The program consists of financial and personal development resources, providing education workshops, scholarships, and more.With the launch of the APA Next program, McDonald's is actually building on 14 years of providing support and resources to Asian Pacific American students. For more resources and information, please go to theapanext.com.今年呢，我们总共将有3场的线上研讨会。第一场已经是上周六9月18日举办完毕，而下一场呢将在10月23日举办。每一场都将邀请到教育专家、大学招生官和大家一起来分享议题，所以大家千万不要错过其中的任何一场哦。Today, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Barry Norman to share about how to deal with changes in college admission.All the speeches will have a Q&A section, and if you have any questions, please feel free to leave your comments down below in the comments section. 接下来呢，要为大家正式的介绍今天的活动议程。今天呢，我们邀请到了 Dr. Barry Norman 来分享如何应对大学招生的变化。在演讲结束之后，我们还有 Q&A 的环节。大家呢，如果有任何的疑问，都欢迎在下方的聊天室留言。Actually, now I want to introduce Dr. Norman a little bit. She's the co-founder and head counselor of the Expert Admissions. She's a certified educational planner and worked as an admission officer at Barnard College, Columbia University. And she has been featured as an expert on college admissions by virtually every major media outlet, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Early Show CBS, The Today Show, NBC, and etc. 为大家介绍一下 Dr. Barry Norman， 他是一名专业的教育规划师，曾在哥伦比亚大学巴纳德学院担任招生官。几乎所有的主流媒体都对他进行过采访，其中包括有纽约时报、华尔街日报、早期秀 CBS 以及今日秀 NBC 等等。那接下来呢，我们话不多说，让我们有请 Dr.
Norman。So much. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Barry Norman. I am a former admissions officer at Barnard College, part of Columbia University. I have been working now with students on the other side of the desk, as we like to say, helping them figure out where they want to go to college and helping them strategize to get the best possible results. And from a variety of backgrounds at a variety of levels, and especially focus on students who are high achieving and helping them plan best to make the most of their college applications. And today I am here to share with you a little bit more about that. So first and foremost, there's been a lot of changes with regard to COVID. The pandemic has changed the college admissions process in ways that we could not have expected. There have been changes in the admissions process that seemed like they might be coming in 5 or 10 years, and it all happened over the course of a couple of weeks. Some of them will be long-standing changes, some might be more temporary, but either way, students who are thinking about college admissions need to be thinking about the new normal in college admissions. So a couple of things. First, in many ways, things have completely changed, and in other ways, they've stayed entirely the same, and I'll say more about that. But the ways in which we've seen changes, if we start with academics first, a lot of schools have handled the pandemic differently. And so some things have been impacted, like teacher availability, courses. Obviously, the transition to online learning for some students was quite disruptive and impacted their grades. For other students, it was a welcome change. They were able to do better. It depends on the student and it depends on the school, but there's been a lot of shifts and changes, and academics are the most important thing in the college admissions process. And so this does have significant impacts. If you attend a high school where online learning maybe was a tougher transition and your grades went down, I would encourage you to include an additional statement, either using the COVID essay or just using additional information to give a little bit of context. When you give context, it can't be an excuse or seem like you're trying to make up for something. You're trying just to give them some basic facts and information to give context to what has happened. So it should be a very, very brief statement, and it should focus really intently on just the facts. If there was a teacher switch, if it was just a difficult transition with school and it was kind of clunky and difficult to kind of engage, you can say things like that and that your grade was impacted. But again, very short and sweet. I have also a number of students where their grades went up considerably because of COVID. This generally was something that happened across the board, meaning everybody in the class or everybody in the school kind of saw the same thing. One of the things about college admissions that's very important to know is that you're always looked at in the context of your high school. So they can't compare you to a student at a different school down the street. They can't compare two different private schools, a private versus a public school. So you're always being evaluated in the context of your high school. So these kinds of things that happen typically won't have impacted just you, although certainly sometimes there are independent, situations. But you have to also find out, is your school counselor going to be mentioning any of these things in their letter of recommendation or in their school report? But no matter what, as the applicant, you do want to consider these things. So there's academics. Huge changes, as we all know, in testing and in a number of different ways. So most obviously, and the biggest news was that almost every single college went test optional last year. There were a couple of exceptions. The University of Florida system comes to mind. This year, University of Georgia brought it back. Very few places brought it back this year. They were one system that did. That was test optional last year. But generally speaking, more than 2/3 of colleges are test optional. And for our students, every single school that they would remotely consider remains test optional for 2021, 2022. We expect that most of these colleges will be test optional going forward in the future. Some will revert back to testing, but most are going to stay test optional in theory, meaning you can be evaluated without scores. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not to your benefit to submit scores, but it does mean that there's, in theory, the option not to and to still be considered. Back to testing. So with test optional, it is optional. Before the pandemic, it would have been the case that if you didn't submit scores, they would have not evaluated your application. Now you can actually be considered without scores. Now, depending on your demographic, depending on your background, you may want to consider whether or not you want to go test optional. In my experience, it has been the case when students get scores, it is to their benefit. It strengthens their application. If you can't submit scores because they're so low that you know that they're going to knock you out, and we do know that low testing can knock students out in and of itself, If that's the case, then of course you're going to opt not to submit the scores. It doesn't increase your chances of getting in, and it can decrease your chances of getting in without having that data. But again, if scores were going to knock you out regardless, you're in better shape to submit without them. If you are considering whether or not, trying to consider whether or not to send scores, look at the middle 50% for a particular school. You should realistically be at the very top or outside of the mid 50%, so the upper 25%, if you're going to submit scores and it's a highly selective school. Even for a more reasonably selective school, the fact is that you want the scores to be competitive in their range, in their pool, if you want it to help you. So really think carefully about that. You can potentially submit scores to one school and not to another. There's the ability to do that on the Common Application and with your score reporting. So you want to be, you can and you want to be strategic about it. But I would really encourage all students to think about this process as if it was not test optional. Try to get the best scores that you can. Try to submit scores. You'll generally see better results, and you'll certainly be able to predict the results better, and also strategize as a result better in the end. The other change is that a lot of schools have been dropping the AP curriculum, and students have been concerned that without the AP classes, and therefore, should they take the AP exams to show another good test score? My general advice is no. Strong AP scores generally come from students who have strong scores on other standardized tests, and most importantly are the grades that you earn in the classes. So I wouldn't start scheduling AP exams just because there's no AP test to kind of show additional knowledge. It's not necessary and it's not going to change anything. There may be exceptions if you didn't do well in a class, but you think you can do very well on an AP exam. That could be a reason to potentially take an AP exam, but it's not going to erase the poor grade in the class. So generally speaking, I would stay away from that. The other testing that has come up is subject tests. So subject tests were eliminated last year. They're not offered anymore. And some students may have taken a couple or even a few prior to them being discontinued. If you have them and you want to submit them this year, it's fine. It's not going to move the needle in any way. And so there's no need to, and certainly anybody who didn't get to finish subject tests, they were kind of on their way out and barely relevant before they were canceled. Them being canceled was a really non-issue. So few students had been taking them, except for a couple of schools where they really encouraged them, but it was really such a small piece of the application. And again, students would only submit them. They were recommended in most places and really truly like optional. Students would only submit them if they were strong. And if they were strong, it generally mimicked what the SAT or ACT scores were. So again, not adding any new or additional information. So the disruption to a subject test, complete non-issue, don't worry about it. Now, when it comes to extracurricular activities, this was probably one of the biggest areas of disruption. Students didn't have access to activities. Activities changed in really significant ways. Sometimes they were canceled entirely. Some moved to Zoom, but it obviously made engaging and doing things much more difficult. The one thing that colleges have been flexible on some things. We've seen it with test optional, certainly. We're seeing it to some degree even with academics, but where they have really not been flexible from the beginning of the pandemic has been on extracurricular activities. They expect students to be doing something with their time. They're flexible in the sense that it may not be as curated or as direct a line as it would have been before. However, they absolutely, even at the start of the pandemic for students last year, they expected that students would be productive. What you do is up to you, how you engage. You don't want to be standard strong. You want to make sure that you're really engaging at the highest level possible, whatever it is you're interested in. But they absolutely want you and expect for you to be productive with your time. And they did not give students a break or a pass on that. In fact, some of them, I think because they were at home finding new hobbies and doing different things with their time, almost had higher expectations. What we've seen with students, if you're out there and you're a student in a class, who's either a current senior or younger, what we really have seen is just that, again, students have been, not surprisingly, very resourceful, very creative, and have been able to make it work. And so, again, it may not have been as perfectly sort of straight line as it would have been, because certainly summer plans and other things were impacted. But people have found ways, creative ways, to make it work. And so that's a really, really important piece. It's an important piece in the process no matter what. The more selective the school, the higher their expectations are academically as well as extracurricularly. Other important things to note about changes for COVID: campus visits. Those obviously were not happening, some are still not happening, but there has been an explosion in virtual programming, some of it very, very good. Absolutely attend these virtual programs. When colleges email you, make sure you click on the links. They're tracking that to see if you are engaging or are you not opening the emails at all. If there's a representative visiting your school in person or virtually, make sure to be prepared to speak about that school and to speak about yourself and to talk to the admissions officer. These are all very, very important pieces to the process. What we've also seen in the wake of test optional, as is always the case, pandemic or no pandemic, when a school goes test optional, the applications go up. Not surprisingly, this is what we saw for the most part for schools that went test optional last year, most notably at the upper level. So Ivy League colleges and similarly selective colleges like Stanford, MIT, Northwestern, Vanderbilt, these kinds of super selective colleges in and out of the Ivy League saw a drastic increase in applications, which of course means increased competitiveness. So it's important in the wake of the pandemic, even though there are changes afoot, to try and make sure as best you can that you navigate around them and that you treat the process almost as if these changes weren't happening. So you don't take the pass on the tests. You don't take the pass on the extracurriculars because you say, well, my activity was canceled or I wasn't able to do this anymore. If that's the case, find something else that does work. Yes, testing was more difficult, but everybody who wanted to take a test in our practice was able to take a test at the end. It might have been a little later than they had planned, of course, but they were able to access it. So don't use the pandemic as an excuse. Try to navigate as best you can around it. Of course, some students will be in situations where there has been drastic loss, where there's been a significant impact on their family. I'm not talking to those people. Obviously, in those situations, that's a different story. But for students who are out there who, like the rest of us, were kind of just in this collectively difficult situation, we were able to help students navigate around it and present the strongest applications possible. And in an ideal world, that's exactly what you'd like to do. So things have definitely changed, as I started out by saying, but at the same time, we try to treat the process really as it always has been, give admissions officers what they're familiar with and what they're looking for, and do the best that you can in executing in that application and in your strategy for where you choose to apply, and certainly if you're applying early, where you choose to apply early. So best of luck to everybody. I hope this is helpful. And as things change, we'll always be looking for ways that we need to adjust as well.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing.
And I'm sure all the viewers got a tons of questions they want to ask you. So we're going to jump right into the Q&A section. 谢谢我们 Dr. Norman 精彩的分享，我们受益匪浅。相信呢，各位观众朋友们也有很多的问题要问他。那没有关系，我们接下来直接进入到我们的问答环节。So I'm sure one of the questions, I want to ask that, how can Asian students like me can stand out in the admission process?
That's a great question. This is something that comes up often with students that I'm working with, Asian students in particular. They want to know how they can stand out not only amongst the larger applicant pool, but amongst Asian students. And it's an important question and one that often is not discussed, but we know it's relevant. And so I'm happy to speak to this. So obviously I'm speaking in large generalities here. Asian students. I see Asians different levels across the spectrum. But where this question comes up often is amongst high achieving Asian students who say, you know, so many of my peers have great scores. So many of my peers have perfect grades. And I see that, certainly. We see a lot of, you know, very, very high test scores, straight A's in the hardest curriculum, and then often see even similar extracurricular activities amongst this demographic. So when I do these kinds of programs in person, I will ask the audience for a raise of hands, and I'll say, how many people here play an instrument like the cello, piano, violin? And almost every single person will raise their hand. And then I'll say, all right, now how many people by raise of hands are interested in the STEM fields, want to be pre-med, science, technology, engineering, math? A vast majority of the hands will go up. And it really just goes to show that for whatever reason, culturally or otherwise, there's a strong interest and support of students going into these areas. And it is more of a challenge, right? It does start feeling like, gosh, you know, it can be hard to distinguish when people are doing kind of a lot of the same things. Now, one of the things that's important to remember is that you're always being evaluated in the context of your high school. So what your school offers is important, but what you choose to take advantage of is important as well. So I'm not telling anybody whose natural, genuine interests are in these areas to not do them. But what I am suggesting is that students look and see, are there other things that I'm interested in as well? Or if you're a younger student, you haven't really figured out what exactly you're interested in, or maybe you've tried some of these things out and you've been doing it, but you don't really like it, you just keep doing it because you're doing it, is try to figure out, are there other things? And when I do have students who have strong interests and also high achievements in the sciences, in an area of music or in an instrument, you know, their first chair, or they're in a very high level orchestra or whatever, I will encourage them in the application to not talk about those things. Hopefully they'll have other interests. For students where I'm working with them from earlier on, I can help them explore other things and figure some other things out. For students who might be coming as a 12th grader, who needs help on their applications, that's something where we can kind of think about what they've already been interested in or involved in or things like that. But we can't obviously pursue new opportunities at that point. But either way, it's helpful when students have other things to talk about. The other thing is that it's not that we don't mention those things or that they're not important or relevant, particularly if you've had some high achievements in those areas, but there are other places in the application where we can get that job done. And so as the main essay in particular is not the place for it. Very commonly, my Asian students will kind of initially gravitate towards a couple of different topics. One is relating to the culture clash between Chinese and American. Oftentimes it's framed as a generational clash between the student and their parents or the student and their grandparents. There's also always sort of this conversation about being a mix of the two and trying to reconcile, or the unique balance that they themselves are made up of. So with that, I have had some students write those essays very effectively, but that is a very, very small piece of the essay. It's really more of a springboard for the student to then talk about themselves. This is where it can get tricky with parent feedback. So some parents see the essay, some parents don't, but sometimes the parents who do see the essay, they'll say, you can't talk about that. You know, that doesn't reflect well on our family, or you can't speak about that publicly, or certainly you can't speak about that to admissions officers, when exactly the opposite is true. Nobody is judging your family. They're certainly not going to judge you in a way that would negatively impact your admission. What we're really trying to do for all students is to have a personal essay, one that is unique to you, one that really gets at who you are, that really is not just skating the surface. These essays about culture clashes, generational clashes, mixing of cultures, and really almost any topic, it's very easy to write a generic essay, but you have to remember just how many essays someone is reading in a day on the admission side. And you have to remember that your job is to compel them to admit you amongst what is usually tens of thousands of highly qualified applicants. Maybe it's thousands, but either way, your job is to compel them to admit you. And if you don't do that, you're going to find yourself with less exciting and less exciting results and results that you would have hoped for. I always tell my students that you need the essay to work for you. You need it to hustle for you. If you're just going to kind of mix in with the rest of the crowd, you're not going to get the more ambitious results that you're hoping for. And so you really need to think about, aside from academics, what are some of the things that make you you? There is a place in the supplements to talk a bit about academics, but you never want it to sound like a resume, like a regurgitation of your resume or your achievements. Again, there are other places in the application that we can transmit that information. And it's important information, but this is not the place to do it. So it's really, really important for students to get out of that mentality of, I can't talk about this or I can talk about that. I always tell students that, where the line is for TMI, for too much information, is farther back than they think. We really want to hear about, if you struggled with something, if there have been challenges, if in retrospect you've seen a change in yourself over time and you've evolved. We want to hear about those things, but we don't want to be just stuck in the past. We want to hear about where you are now. There is such thing as sharing too much, and I'll always tell my students that when they've crossed that line. But like I said, the vast majority of times, students, where students think that line is much further out than it actually is. So for Asian students in particular, just as a recap, I would try not to write, for all students, we don't want them to write about their academics in the main essay, but I would certainly try to avoid doing that. I would really try as best you can to think about your other interests and think about your broader interests and how you can speak about them and how you can engage in them. It is common to see really, really strong transcripts, really strong test scores. That certainly isn't going to hold somebody back, but part of the overall profile of a student, everything is making that up, right? And so when you see these sort of, a perfect transcript, perfect or close to perfect test scores, and then you see those like kind of telltale, the instruments, the science. If you think about it from an admissions officer's perspective, it can be difficult, right? If you don't do your job as the applicant to really show who you are as an individual, how you're unique, then it makes it difficult for them to say, yes, I have to have this particular student from your demographic or any other demographic for that matter. And so just remember, you have a job as the applicant to help them understand who you are. And it really needs to get beneath the surface. Also, when you're thinking about extracurricular activities, like I mentioned before, you do want to go beyond standard strong. Some activities lend itself to certain competitions or levels, others do not. Again, it's your job as the applicant to figure out how you can engage in a meaningful way and substantive way if you don't have those kinds of competitions or things like that. The other thing I'll say is that there are a lot of students who do science research. They're in a lab or sometimes they're shadowing, a doctor or something like that. But the most common thing is to be either working in a lab or doing independent research through a school science research program. And again, if you just remember just how many students are doing that, you can realize just how hard it can be on the other side for the admissions officers. I'm thinking of a student that I work with a couple of years ago who was interested in computer science, an Asian young woman who had the background that you would expect, and she really wanted to go to Carnegie Mellon Computer Science, which is like pretty much the hardest program you can want to get into. And as an Asian student, we knew that she would have even a more difficult time, but we really focused a lot on not only, of course, we had to show the match for computer science and all the things that she did to make her prepared for such a rigorous and competitive program, but we also thought more broadly, and we really used that in her application, and she got in and she's there now. And it's just so incredibly important to remember that you actually do have a unique perspective and to try and make sure that you convey that. Another thing just to think about a little bit is how you can kind of set up your program when it comes to electives, for instance, with the main core academic areas, English, history, math, science, foreign language, those things you really want to stick to, the most rigorous courses you possibly can while also being able to do well. But in addition to that, you want to make sure that if you do have the opportunity for an elective, for instance, that you try and go outside of your comfort zone. Try and do things that's not another math class, that's not another STEM class, that's not another science. Sometimes students will double up, but when given the opportunity, if it can be sort of a segue, to something new and different, you can find yourself being able to explore something that way. And I'm also thinking about a former student of mine who was math team all the way and had tremendous accomplishments in that realm. But all he did was math. I mean, it was at an exceptional level, but everything had to do with math team and math competitions. And we worked really hard to find something else at the end of the day that he also was interested in. And it took us like a full academic year for him to try different things out and figure out what would stick, because it's not just about doing it. You have to be able to speak about it and speak about it well and speak about it personally. And if you're going to fake it, the truth is that it's typically pretty obvious that people don't care. That's where the generic essays tend to come in. And so sometimes school can be a great resource for finding those alternate, or additional areas of interest and things like that. So don't lose sight of that. But yeah, the main thing is really about being authentic and being yourself. That often for many of my Asian students is sort of counter to what culturally they're used to kind of embracing or being comfortable with. But in this process, it's very highly valued, and it's what helps make students stand out. Now, there's the part about you, which is the main essay, and then there's also the supplemental essays, which need to be enormously tailored to every school, not just by mentioning a specific professor or class or extracurricular activity, but by having a really good sense of each school and being able to present yourself as somebody who matches with that. Because again, it's not about how you see it as a match, you need them to see you as a match. And again, if you're going to submit more generic, surfacey kinds of things, that's going to make it harder for you to stand out. And when you're within, sort of a sub-demographic, you're in the Asian student population, and we do tend to see a lot of sort of similar activities, or seeing a lot of strong grades, strong scores, there's sort of an extra piece, that you need to think about. Now, for all high achieving students, there's an extra piece they need to think about, going beyond standard strong. So this is sort of one additional tack in a larger kind of strategy and larger context. Some of the things that we're talking about apply to all students, the idea of standing out, for instance. But like I said, for Asian students in particular, there's a little bit more to think about, and you want to think a little bit more broadly. But I hope that that's helpful. And the most important thing is follow the things that are of interest to you.
Yeah, I totally agree. Far too often for Asian students and parents, we want to make ourselves like very confident, like the Iron Women, Superman, but sometimes you can just get vulnerable and then share a little bit personal information. You don't always need to be that perfect straight A student. Sometimes, and also, in the essays, just like you said.
Yeah, and there's a process for everybody, to getting there. And, sometimes I find more often it's that students feel uncomfortable going farther. I absolutely have students who, once they get comfortable, they go too far, and you have to be careful about that too. I think also you mentioned a good point, and the idea of perfectionism, which is valued in many cultures, or seemingly valued in many cultures, is, yes, they want perfection, like close to perfect in terms of grades. Yes, you want to try and get obviously the best grades that you can, and you want to try and get the highest scores that you can. But perfection and perfectionism and a precision to the point of rigidity is bad. And that's what you don't want. And that's also where a line often is there's this perfection and precision to the point of rigidity and seeming rigid. And no college wants somebody who seems rigid and unwilling or unable to learn and change and adapt. And that also is an important cultural piece. And it's not just Asian cultures. There are a lot of cultures that are like this too. But you want to understand that there is a fine line, right, between the two. And it's sort of wanting two things at once. They want those sort of close to perfect grades and close to perfect scores, and you need a personality to sort of carry that out, but they don't want that personality sort of more broadly. But the perfectionistic piece is a really, really important one. I'm glad you mentioned it.
That's great, yeah. And from my personal experience, I feel like a very important part is to ask yourself the question, who am I? Who I truly am? And then why the school want me? And then that's the good way to go down the road to write the essay. Thank you very much. And
it's about who am I, not who do people want me to be. Who does the college want me to be? Who do my parents want me to be? Who do my friends want me to be? It's about who am I and who do I want to be for myself. That should be the focus of the essay.
That's right. Thank you very much, Dr. Norman. This is such a thought-provoking conversation with you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and good luck to everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye. Thank you. 谢谢。
再一次感谢 Norman 博士的精彩的演讲和非常具有启示性的这样一个问答的环节哈，相信如果您认真听了，一定是获益匪浅。那么接下来呢，就到了一个比较轻松的环节，相信也是大家很关注的一个环节，那就是我们的抽奖环节了。Wow! Now is for the sweepstakes for today. All right, I'm sure that you're really looking forward to this. Let's see what are the things that we have prepared for you. All right, we have 2 AirPods, 1 iPad, 50 McDonald's gift cards, also a 15 subscription of the mental health and awareness app Shine. And hopefully you are the lucky one. And don't worry, if you are the lucky one, we're going to contact you. We will reach out to you and make sure that you have your cell phone ready for the lucky call. 好的，那接下来呢，就是我们的抽奖环节。世界日报及麦当劳为了支持华人学子在学业上有更好的资源，在每场活动结束之后，会由工作人员从报名者当中抽出幸运儿，送出的奖品呢，大家可以透过大荧幕看到，总共有2个 AirPods、1个 iPad、50张麦当劳礼卡以及15名 subscriptions of mental health and awareness app Shine。在这里呢，也预祝大家都中奖哦。Before we conclude today's online workshop, I want to introduce the APA Next again. It is an all-new education program from McDonald's that aims to empower and uplift Asian Pacific American students throughout their academic journey. The program consists of financial and personal development resources, also providing education workshops, and also scholarships and more. With the launch of the APA Next program, McDonald's building on 14 years of providing support and resources to Asian Pacific American students. For more resources and content like today's workshop, please visit apanext.com. If you learned something helpful from today's online workshop, you don't want to miss out our next one. We will invite more experts and professionals to our McDonald's Education Online Workshop on the October 23rd. For more detailed information, please check the World Journal website. And the recording of today's workshop will be on the World Journal's official YouTube channel. And you can actually like, subscribe, and forward it to your friends and family at any time. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more updates and future events. 好的，2021年的第2场麦当劳教育线上研讨会到这里就要告一段落了。如果大家很喜欢今天的教育研讨会，那您更不要错过我们10月23日的第3场麦当劳教育研讨会。届时呢，将会有更多的教育专家以及精彩的内容。更多细节信息，请关注《世界日报》官方发布的消息。同时呢，我们这一场博览会的全程录影会放在《世界日报》的官方 YouTube 频道，欢迎大家随时的回看或者是转发。请大家别忘记订阅和关注我们哦。在这里，我们要再一次感谢麦当劳对本次活动的大力支持，也感谢今天的讲师，更要感谢网上的各位观众朋友们的关注和支持。 All right, see you next time. Have a great weekend. Bye. 谢谢观众朋友们，我们10月23日再见，拜拜。